let's get started. Anthony, it's great to have you here as usual and as always in Frankfurt.
Thanks, Timo.
We're at the end of February. You've been here last, if I recall properly, in November, right after the elections,
Yes.
the US elections.
Yes.
And I can probably ask you the same question that we had at the time, which was about the mood in the US on back of the election. So now 3 months in, same question again. What's the mood on back of politics and all the inauguration and start like in the US?
Okay. So I would say many people in America are not as surprised or as shocked about Trump's early moves as here in Europe. I've been traveling for 2 weeks in Europe. Clearly, there's a lot of negativity in the European media and surprise that Trump is following through. But you have to understand, he was elected on 3 main platforms. One is, I would call it, the revenge of the working class. These are people in the last 20 years in the US who feel abandoned by the Clintons and by the establishment, maybe a little bit like your CDU and SPD to some extent. So they basically wanted to throw, let's say, some dynamite into Washington, D.C. and really clean up government. And this Doge situation from Musk is partly a reflection of people believing that there's a ton of wastage, that even though USAID giving support to people, humanitarian support for Ebola and AIDS, generally makes sense, there's a lot of wastage. And that nobody has cleaned up the government really in the last 30 to 40 years since Reagan. No one's really gone in there and tried to do a proper audit. So there is support actually for that, believe it or not. When it comes to the other planks he was voted upon, one is to actually bring up more manufacturing in the US and to reshore and not have these massive trade deficits. And interestingly enough, the one thing that the Republicans and the Democrats both agree on, and most of Americans agree on, is that the Chinese have not been particularly reliable and maybe even honest partners in some ways. There's this view in the American media, this dialogue. So most Republicans and Democrats actually don't agree on very much, but when it comes to the Chinese and keeping AI and keeping tech US dominant, I think that's quite a powerful support base that he has. And the other thing that I think Trump has made clear is that the US deficit, which is almost 7% of GDP, and the US debt to GDP, which is almost 125%, is not sustainable. So you now have business-friendly guys coming in and trying to theoretically clean up the mess of the last 20 to 30 years of overspending, these Afghanistan wars, the Middle East, which has cost over $1 trillion. Of course, Ukraine recently is just a manifestation. So people want to cut back on all these crazy expenditures. So he actually has, in the US, arguably more support than it would appear from the European side.
And you just went into the European side, so if I may ask you for an, let's call it, outside-in view into Europe, with, you've just mentioned Ukraine and of course, the war going on there. Thinking of the elections we've just had recently, last weekend over here in Europe, and some of the situations around that. So the American outside-in view on Europe and our own, let's say, particular challenges.
Yes. So actually, the Republicans and J.D. Vance, who came and gave some hard times at the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago, and it was unpopular, criticizing inside of Europe, they actually view some of the problems you guys are having as a similar situation to what the lower and working class in America was suffering from the last 15 to 20 years, where salaries and wages were stagnant and they were not actually improving their lifestyle. And actually, second generation, next generation, the younger guys can't afford property or houses. And they're transferring this and looking, hey, we have the same problem in the US that many of you guys have. And maybe it's not a surprise the IFD and Alice and these people are actually becoming more popular. So the truth is, I don't think he is endorsing the AFD, honestly, but it's a reflection of saying, hang on, you have 1/5 of your population, voters, being very frustrated. And I just have to step back for a second and say, in America, the Republicans historically did very badly with the working class voters. In fact, they did very badly with Hispanic voters. They did very badly with actually black voters, African American voters. Trump has actually changed the whole dial. He got almost a majority of Hispanic men. He got a lot more black voters than before. And just to summarize, he got the majority of the working class for the first time. And the working class always used to vote for the Democrats because it goes back almost 100 years from Roosevelt's time. So we're having a whole realignment there. And I think they reflect on Germany, just putting an American hat on and saying, my God, don't be surprised if your economy is not growing the next 3-4 years under Merz. What is going to happen, I ask you, Timo, in 3 or 4 years, if the CDU is just very conservative and you have this grand coalition, they're saying there is a risk in 3 or 4 years that the IFD surprises people even more and gets another 8 to 10%. So I think that's part of the calculus.
So if you, for sure, quite some similarities there, and if you asked about the risk, or probably some of the plan you've mentioned, AFD, would actually be to have yet again earlier elections prior to 3 to 4 years, with more people that feel left behind voting to the extremes, be it left, or we've discussed the left-right, total of about 1/3 of the votes.
Yes.
From a, let's say, geopolitical standpoint, with some of his activities just this morning, no surprise, announcing, Trump potentially putting 25% tariffs on Europe. We've mentioned Ukraine. So not just driven by, but let's say accelerated by his inauguration, the geopolitical landscape has changed.
Yes. Look, I think the fact that America was spending 3 times the amounts per GDP even on NATO. When you look at the amount that America was spending, it was sometimes 3-4 times the amount that Europe was spending on NATO. There's this frustration that America can't keep supporting Europe to the same extent. And these deficits and debt to GDPs are not really sustainable. Any other country running a 6-7% debt to GDP per year would be actually, the IMF and the World Bank would be coming down on them like a ton of bricks. So I think you've got quite a lot of business-friendly guys running parts of the US government like never before. The SEC is a business-friendly guy. The head of the FTC, which is Federal Trade Commission. These were people under Biden who, in my space, the tech, like Megatrend that we have with you guys, they were blocking tons of M&A deals, not just in tech, but even airlines. There was an airline called Spirit Airways that went bankrupt because the FTC blocked a merger from a bigger airline to buy them. So you have much more business-friendly people there, you have more deregulation there, and they're trying to reflect on Europe that, hey, Brussels is not great for business. The EU needs to actually also deregulate. Maybe the ESG went a little overboard. You don't hear too much in America about ESG anymore.
Not at all.
And I think there's this reflection that, hang on, we need to understand that the cost of energy here in Germany maybe is not sustainable. Maybe nuclear is a particular way of starting to look at the future, although it doesn't happen overnight. So there is a lot of discussion in the US about, hang on, we need a new model. We can't have crazy energy prices. We don't want to be totally reliant on the Middle East. So drill, baby, drill is partly a reflection of Trump saying, hang on, we want independence. It's not that he is against other guys, but I think they want to make America great again, partly because the American dream has partly evaporated. J.D. Vance wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy. I recommend people read it. And it reads like this book on Germany, a little bit called Kaputt, which came out recently, I mentioned to you, where they are both basically saying the establishment hasn't been helping us for the last 25, 30 years. And J.D. Vance's book, which propelled him to become a senator, is essentially a movie about it. It's all about basically pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and there's still an American dream. But for many people, this dream has gone backwards, unfortunately.
So I have to add a couple of books to that pile next to my bed that's there already for some reading when I find the time. You already went a bit into tech-based investing. You mentioned your product, iTech. Thinking back, inauguration in January in Washington, there's probably been, I didn't count, but all of the Mag 7 and their CEOs represented. I didn't count,
Yes.
but let's say 5 out of the 7. So proximity, some initiatives particularly those large mega tech companies.
Yes.
Investing, have we focused too much on the top mega caps, so the Mag 7, or does a broader, more diversified tech play make more sense?
Since the inauguration, and actually even since the election, the Mag 7 have not been a very good play to be. In fact, they've all gone down, except for Facebook Meta's the only one that's actually been up. We actually think there's going to be a broadening out play, partly, as I mentioned earlier, with M&A being at the lowest level in 10 years in tech under Biden. Now that you've got all these new business-friendly guys coming in, it's going to deregulate. You'll have more IPOs, more M&A, in our opinion. But why also will it have a broadening out? Partly because the federal government is going to downsize the number of workers, and we think cybersecurity contracts will be more awarded to third-party private sector, as well as cloud computing. There's going to be a more business-friendly environment to get government contracts, is what I'm essentially referring to. And just interestingly, since January, the best-performing parts of tech have not necessarily been AI or the ones that the media are covering. It's actually been things like digital entertainment, like cloud computing. Another one that's done very well is cybersecurity. So, and another one in our theme is gene therapy. So those ones, they are using parts of AI, but they're actually a broader tech play that are not in the Mag 7. And if you want exposure to that, you just don't get it in the normal NASDAQ or Mag 7 at the moment. It's very much underweighted, whereas we think those areas, the P ratios just quickly are under 20 times on most of those sub-themes. Whereas NASDAQ and Mag 7 are sitting with PEs of closer to 40. So we think the upside potential, particularly also as inflation comes down later this year, it will probably, it's still a bit sticky, but if it comes down, Trump is putting a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower rates. This will help growth stocks, particularly a lot of these regular large and mid caps that we have in the mega trend.
I know and I'm aware we could go on for hours and it's interesting and we could add a beer to that. And I know tonight you're not having the German schnitzel because you've got to have that plane to London to catch. So I leave you there. Thank you very much, Anthony. Like always, good to have you here and see you next time.
Dankeschön.